So, what am I going to get into today? I'm actually going to dance into a whole bunch of different little things today. But like I said at the top, everything we do today is entirely optional. You don't have to include any of this stuff in anything I've asked you for. This is all just some of the cool stuff you can do now that you understand some of the basics behind putting together web pages, sites, and applications. They all string together the same way. And if you just roll all the way back to the beginning, when we were trying to figure out what was going on and how we would put things together, remember what we start with is we build a document, an HTML document, and the HTML document has a very specific setup and structure to it so that your browser knows what to do. It's really just turning text into a layout in images. And that text it's going to turn out is going to be something, look at that, the wrong display. Is going to turn out to be something relatively straightforward in that we have to tell the browser how to do everything. We have to tell it when to start and when to finish. We have to tell it information we want to give it to say, hey, you're going to need this to draw stuff on the screen. And we're going to give it some information about what to draw on the screen. And that's where we get this basic structure. We have an HTML document. We're telling the browser what kind of document it is. And we've got this head section that says, here's some stuff you might need to know. And we've got this body section which says, here's the stuff I want you to draw on the screen. As we get more sophisticated, we start to add more elements in both of those areas. The head elements typically tell us, how do we make this look? And that we compile together in our cascading style sheets, which have their own special way of writing. The body section, we're going to put together collections of boxes or divs, and those boxes are going to interact with each other. They're going to be able to slide and move around in specific ways. As we start to experiment with these straightforward concepts, we start to realize that there's a huge amount of variability that we can use. And there's a great number of things that we can play with, and the number of possibilities is very much endless and entirely up to creatively, how can you stitch these boxes together? Can you make them go side to side? Can you make them a certain height? Can you make them do something when your mouse hovers over them? Can you make them change color? Can you make them so we can do a number of different things with them? And that's what I'm going to dive into today, some of the more creative ways we can reuse these exact same parts we've already done and use them to do some relatively cool things. So I like to think about this part, about the part that is fancy and sometimes animated, interesting, but absolutely is just there to catch your eye and make things more entertaining. And we start with some simple stuff, and we're going to go a little bit further into how we can work with them. Now, the first thing I'm going to start with is if you take a look on Moodle, you'll find there's a bunch of links on how to do some of these things. And the first one I'm going to go open up is something I wrote. It's in a tool called CodePen. Now, CodePen is one of these sites that embeds microcosm of an HTML page inside their site. It lets you experiment with things without having to build a whole giant page and site like we've done with our main landing page site. And if you go to that CodePen, you'll see something that looks a little bit like this. Now, the interesting part is that the menu I've built here uses nothing but HTML and CSS. There's no JavaScript going on. And it looks pretty boring to begin with. It's just some text on a background. But each of the menus changes color as you hover over them. And when you click on a menu, you can redirect that to a link that could go somewhere else. And making the menu fit in a bar, making it horizontal, and making it hover when you hover over it really just takes a few of the styles that we've already looked at. So feel free to look at this and replicate it in part of your sites if you want to use it. You can see the HTML here, and the HTML is really very small chunk. The part that's nice about this CodePen thing is all I'm showing here is the very specific HTML piece that I'm interested in. I'm not wrapping a whole head section, a whole body section, and a whole page around it. I can't just use this if I fire it up to a third-party web hosting site like GoDaddy. But it's great for me to experiment with things. And they change as you play with them. If I change this, styles on some of these things, I can change the way they look. And as soon as I touch them, they should just change. So I've got some padding around it. Okay. Relative EM units, just like EM units. And you can see all the styles it takes to make the menu system work here. I've got a logo part, which I've just got some text in there for now in a box. And let's take that logo part and make the background a different color. So we go find the class logo. And in that class logo, we change the background color. And you'll see where it shows up. Now, of course, that's not the full height of the entire menu or menu container. So if I wanted the full height of the menu container, I'd have to then add some styles to it to stretch it out. Let's go. Actually, that's not going to do it. And it affects the entire menu because when I make it a certain size, all of the other things inside that container, you look at the HTML, that menu and menu container, are going to have to accommodate the new size that I've given it. So you can experiment with these things without having to build a whole page or site or worry about it breaking. Now the other part is there are other tools we use to be able to build sites and pages and applications without worrying about them breaking. We use things like Git and GitHub to help make backup copies of everything we do, so that when we're working on something, the moment we have it working, we use a tool to save a copy of it. And we do that several times a day as we get things working. And if something breaks, we can always roll back to the previous version. Those tools are stuff that we may talk about next term if those of you are interested in it. So these navigation bars and navigation links are all designed to redirect you to another location. You click the link, you go somewhere else. Now, when we style them all, we're also going to style them so that they fit nicely in the boxes. If I take away my logo styling and make the whole background menu something different, this links style, I can just put a border around. I get that dashed green border around things. And that shows me where those divs are. Those are what we call debugging tools, debugging aids. And again, in CodePen, I can play around with this, change it all I want. Now, this CodePen I've showed you, if you click on the link and you go there, you can go edit it too. There's no worry about breaking anything. It's my CodePen. You can't save it. You can edit here to your heart's content and just try things out. We can learn things experimentally. See what the different styles are and what they do. So that's the first element that we want to play around with. One of the first things we typically do is we put some sort of menu in our application. And we did this last time. I built a menu in the application. I didn't make my menu bar very pretty, very large. I just kind of threw it in there. And we have some links. And one of the links, when I click on the contact sheet, is an anchor link that connects to another HTML page. And that HTML page had the form that I created in it. The form has a couple buttons in it, and those have anchor links around them as well to take us back and reload the index page back again. So at this point, we now have a website because we have multiple pages that can link together. All right. After we've got basic, straightforward layout working for us, we're going to want to build some stuff that lets us play around with the look of what we've got going. And while we might use some image tags for very static images, there are times when we're probably going to want to do some more interesting things with animation, with images. So we're going to start with CSS backgrounds. And then early, I showed you backgrounds, and I showed you how to use a background to fill a div with some image. Now we can start to play around creatively with how we use those images. The way we have to think about it is that every div is a box on the screen, and that all of these boxes are stacked like Photoshop front to back. So when we put an image on one of those divs, those background images can be manipulated. They can be twisted, rotated, shifted. They can be replaced. And so when we put those things together, we can start to create interesting effects that might happen. Now, just as a reminder, some of the things that we have to be careful of with images, background CSS images will run very much faster than image tags. They're more dynamic in that we can change them with either CSS or with JavaScript. Image tags are pretty much static. When we're playing around with background images, we're not just playing around with background images, but we can always play around with background colors. And this is where we can start to take advantage of the way that CSS applies this background style. There's nothing that prevents us from having multiple backgrounds on a div. If you were to do multiple background colors, for instance, well, let's just go back to our nav bar and try it. If I make this menu area, which has a color and what do we got? Menu container. Color nav. Background color. There we go. So that's on the whole class. Let's add another background color. Let's go RGB. Let's pick 5. What do you think is going to happen? Let's make it more distinct. Which background color wins?
RGB.
Right, the last one in. Part of the cascading part of cascading style sheets is they get applied in order, the way they appear in the file. You'll have to repeat that. Right. Let's just do that. Okay. So the next thing we can do is, what happens if I add a background color with alpha? I get part of it showing through. I make it really not much. I get various amounts of it coming through. So I can combine backgrounds. I can transition backgrounds. More importantly, when I'm doing something, I have a specific color and I want to use alpha with it, what I should be doing is creating a background color before I state my background color with an alpha, and have that background color have no alpha on it. It's kind of like this is our fallback color. If we run into a browser that can't do alpha colors, then we'll run to that fallback color. So we use the cascade to our advantage. Now we can do this with colors. Can we do this with images? And the answer is yes. And when we start to think about doing it with images, now we start to try and figure out, well, why would we do that? And how would we do that? And the reason we would do that mostly is because we want to animate something. As long as we have a box, we can put anything we want in that box. And if the background image is, say, an image of a character or a sprite that has some cutout, some alpha around the outside, we can make an actual character that moves on the screen. And we would go through and use some of our CSS to set up this animation. Now, before we get there, we're going to need to look at how do we actually put an animation together. When we're doing a traditional animation, you can think about a typical flipboard type animation, or you take a stack of post-it notes. You draw an image on each post-it note and you flip through them quickly, and the changes in the image will appear as if the image is animated. When we animate something on the web, we do the same thing. We create an image, and the image has multiple versions or frames of the same character in a slightly different pose. When we build them, and we quite often build them in tools like Photoshop, we'll build them so that each pose is in the same file, in the same image, and they're all side by side. And what we'll do is we'll put that background image behind a div that's the size of just one of those frames. To animate them, we have to somehow tell things to take that image and slide it behind the little div. And when we try and make that happen, we're going to use some of the CSS tools to manipulate that image. Now, the other things we can do with background images all have to do with doing a whole bunch of math. And trying to explain the math, particularly online here, is a really daunting task. I'm going to give you a page to look at that has a bunch of images on how these different translations fit and how they move. But we're going to use some of these CSS translations to kind of play around with some of the things we want to show. So we're going to start with some animation stuff because it's kind of the most fun thing to play with. Let's see if this is one. So in this particular sample, I have a whole bunch of images. These are the Java logo guy I stole. And this image is an image that I've grabbed. Let's see if we can make that text a little bigger. We can drag that around. All right. In that image tag, I've got an image I'm pulling from the internet. And this is what we call a sprite sheet. Someone's gone into Photoshop, taken our little Java guy, and made copies of him. There are exactly 10 copies of him. And with each copy, they've altered him a little bit. Now, in order to animate something, we need to turn around and have these things not all show at once, but we only want to show one of them. Well, how do we do that? Well, if we think about our HTML, we can create a box. So what if we created a box around one of them? And imagine that box being set up in such a way that everything outside of the box doesn't get drawn. In other words, we can put a background image in it, but we only show what the box is over top of. Now, if we scale our background image correctly, we're only going to see one of the Java guys at a time. You with me so far? It'll make more sense in a sec. Once I can see just one of them, I'm going to take advantage of some new capabilities that CSS has. And CSS has the ability to create animation functions. Go from here to there, change this CSS from this value to that value over a certain amount of time. And what we're going to do is we're going to use it like a flip book. In our HTML, we're just going to have our animated guy show up on the screen. Now, I've got a really cute thing going here. If we look at this input line, this is from the forums the other day, and this is a checkbox. And this checkbox is kind of invisible. Okay? That invisible checkbox has a state. It's either checked or not. And I'm using it as a button, so I don't have to write JavaScript. When I click on it, I get the new animated guy. And how do I get the new animated guy? Well, when I click on it, I update this div. And in that div, I have my Java guy down here. This div is this Java guy. Now, when we look at the CSS for it, it gets a little bit trickier. The CSS for it is going to use CSS animation. Now, I'm going to walk through this in a little more detail, but when we're defining a CSS animation, I've got two classes on this, a high class and a Java guy class. The high class defines the background image, and you notice the background size is 1,000%. I have 10 frames of animation. 100% would be the full size of the div. 10 frames of animation is 10 times that size. 10 times 100% is 1,000%. I set the background position at 0, 0, and I tell it to play an animation. The animation to play is called play. It's supposed to do it in 0.8 of a second chunks. It's supposed to take 10 discrete steps and loop infinitely. And the play animation uses CSS's keyframes tag. And the keyframes in CSS allows me to give an animation a name, and it lets me to define a start position and an end position. Now in this case, my background position is what I'm playing with. And if you want to think about it, you can think about having a box. think about having some device in front of you. And this is my div. And what I'm really doing is I'm taking the background image and putting it behind and sliding it this way. As I slide it, I get a different image each time. If I slide it fast enough, they animate. And step back and animate. And this is what's going on with our little Java guy waving. So it makes for an interesting way that we can add little animations to our site. Now, whether they're spinners, whether they're UI elements, I can still add all the regular CSS and HTML components to that. All of the hard part in the HTML in this little code pen is all about making the show hide buttons work. These buttons. And that's all done with a checkbox. When I have something that's checked, it's no longer hidden. So this part is hidden until I check the checkbox. Once it's showing, then I have the arrow. That's this guy. And then another checkbox sitting on top of the arrow because I might want to animate that. So I can make things animate and move around the page. The first animation is moving the background image. Okay, the first animation is moving the background image. The second animation, when I click the arrow, clicks the second checkbox on top of the arrow. And that triggers another animation. That animation is the slide right. And the slide right is a separate animation that performs what we call a transform. That transform does a translation or moves something on the page to a new position. And I just give it a new position, 400 pixels to the right. Now, we can use these transforms to manipulate any part of our HTML page. Now, I know I've lost a bunch of you at this part. I'm talking about transforms, animations, really wild stuff, but how does this fit in what I'm doing? But if you go back and look at some of your favorite web pages, some of the web pages that you think have really clever designs, you'll find a lot of them have these little embellishments all over the pages. Whether it's a set of background images that are using some parallax to just move them gently in the background to make it look alive. Whether it's things tied to menus or menu items that actually animate as you move them. Whether it's things that we use just with text. I mean, if we just play around with text, okay, and we just try and run. Is this guy going to go? It doesn't have the button. Just reload it. So that little bounce in uses the same animation. It uses the animation called bounce in. And it runs over a 2-second span. Here's the animation. It says when it starts at 0% time, I want you to scale it to 10% of its size. And I want it to be opacity 0, so invisible. At 60% of the way through the total time, I want you to scale it to 120%. And I want you to make it solid. And at 100% of the time, I want you to scale it to 100%. Bounce in and come back to normal size. Percentage of the time when we declare our animation, we tell it how long we want the animation to play. Reload. So now it's going to go over and over and over again. I just added the infinite keyword to our animation. So there's a couple links on Moodle on how to set up specific sprite sheets to work with animations if you want to do an animated character. It can all be done with CSS. Doesn't require any JavaScript at all. And one of the things we see in modern websites is we see that you want something moving or animating all the time, but you don't want something annoying like my hello bouncing forever. What we can do in CodePen is play around with some of the parameters to see how they work. In particular, I can play around with the timing. I can make it take longer. Make it take really long. I can make this look like a loop. I can make it go right back to its original style just by changing how it's changed over time. – 60% of the way through the time, I'm going to make it 100% scale and 100% opacity, and at 100%, I'm going to set it back to the original scale. Now, it's going to grow up super big. Then it's going to transition. Doesn't actually transition very nicely. Let's do this. CSS is just going to interpolate for us. From nothing to something, back to nothing. So, how do we build these things? If you're interested in playing around with it, the first part is you can either find a sprite sheet, they're relatively easy to find online, or you can build one yourself in Photoshop. If you're building it yourself in Photoshop, what you want to do is create an image with an alpha channel, in other words, a transparent background, and then create copies of that image in separate layers. As Photoshop stacks up the layers, what you can tell Photoshop to do when it exports it is export it as a sprite. The other thing you need to do when you do it is you need to understand exactly how big your image is and be precise about it. Is it 100 pixels by 50? Then every image needs to be 100 pixels by 50. When you tell Photoshop to export it as a sprite, what it'll do is it'll take all the layers and it'll flatten them out into separate images. The reason we copy them into layers is because in Photoshop it's much easier to take an image, make a copy of it in a layer, change it, make a copy of it in the next layer, change it again, make a copy of it in a layer, change it again. So we can build our own sprite sheets. Okay. Once we have those, we can use them to animate with CSS animations. Now, those CSS animations let us animate DOM elements. As you saw with the hello text, I was really just changing the scale on something, sizing it up and sizing it down. And I was changing the opacity on it. How transparent is it? We can animate all of the CSS sprites we want. That's manipulating the background images. And finally, if we get really crazy, far beyond what we're doing here, is there's an HTML element called a canvas. And the canvas HTML element is for programmers to draw using JavaScript. So if you ever see one of those canvas type elements, that's what it's there for. It's there for programmers to draw things procedurally with programming with JavaScript code. The background is probably the most common one that you'll see, and there's a lot of really powerful things you can do with it. Most of the time, they're things that we can play with. So I think there's a couple links on Moodle that will give you a sprite sheet. There's a couple additional articles on how to play around with CSS and CSS backgrounds and gradients and animating things. And you can look there to get further information on how you might want to put some of these pieces together. Now I'm going to take a short break, and when we come back from the break, we're going to switch gears again, and we're going to start talking about responsive kind of design before we come back to some of the animation stuff. All right? I'll come back at, 5 to 10? Okay, so I started with talking about CSS animation, not because it's the simplest thing or it's the easiest thing, because I want you to have an idea of some of the things that are within your grasp that you can do that's kind of interesting to play around with. I can come back and go in more in depth into how you'd set up an animated thing all on your own. But something far more useful than CSS animation is probably the idea of doing responsive design in your web applications. And this starts from the design side, where we've focused on building a site that's flexible. That is, if I take a look at my application, I've got a bunch of content in the middle here, and as I change the size of the browser, the boxes automatically rearrange themselves. And that just comes for free by using a flex box. But I think all of us will agree that my menu's messed up at that point. My boxes don't exactly align the right way. I kind of want to change the CSS as my site changes its dimensions so that it looks good here and it looks good in a lot of different locations. And by different locations, I mean different devices. The reality these days is that most people have not just a computer they work on, whether it's a Mac or a PC is kind of irrelevant. It's a large screen device. Plus they'll have a phone and they'll have probably a tablet. And when you're the one designing for those particular kinds of devices, there's a couple things that you're going to want. One, you're going to want a consistency of look and feel. You're going to want the client site to look good on all devices. That means readable. That means we don't just want to scale things so that our fonts grow or shrink depending on the device we're on. We want to make things customized for each specific device. And this way of thinking, this way of working, also ties into the idea that on all of these devices, we have browsers that are just as capable as on any other device. Your phone's browser has just as much capability as the browser that you use on your desktop. And if you're wondering about that, I'm going to give you a little demo here. Just in case you're wondering just how much power your browser has. Your browser can do amazing things, 3D things, graphical things. This is all a web page. It uses JavaScript on top of CSS, but I can grab that ball and move it. And I can go a step further. That's all just running in my browser. And that's all just JavaScript, HTML, and CSS to make that happen. So the extent to which you can go is kind of unlimited. But how do I make this look good, whether it's on my phone or whether it's on my tablet or whether it's on my computer? Well, the starting point is to realize that your design needs to accommodate what those different devices have as strengths and weaknesses. So when we talk about responsive design, we're talking about designs that respond to where they're being displayed, as opposed to a flexible design, which this is. It's flexible, it changes and stretches and grows based on the size of my browser, but doesn't necessarily look great on a mobile device. So in order to make it look great everywhere, I have to start with some ideas about what can I do and what do mobile devices have as their particular constraints. And this is where we get into the design side. And Adobe actually has a really nice demo of this on the Adobe XD site. Adobe XD is one of those kind of applications that web developers love and hate. It makes you really, really fast at doing design and layout, and the HTML and CSS that it spits out is practically unusable. So it's a nice tool for figuring out layout. If we look at Adobe XD's site, it has a nice example here of what we think of as a responsive design. Now, the design here is broken into columns, and this is kind of one of the standard ways that we implement that golden rectangle, is that we slice our page up into an equal number of portions, usually 12 or 16, and we determine which columns or which portions of that ratio we want to use for which piece of content. And we do that all with CSS. When we start thinking about responsive design, we start to think about, well, how would that scale, or how would that look on different devices? And how would the content in the columns change? Now, in this example that I have animating behind me here, it's just scaling things, but you'll notice at some point it pops as it gets smaller and we lose a sidebar. Because at some point, either our screen size got so small that the sidebar was irrelevant, or the content of the sidebar should go somewhere else, or the sidebar is replaced by something else. Now, when we start thinking about these responsive designs, they really have to come from where are you going to see this site? And most of the time these days, we're going to start with a mobile device, then we're going to add some sort of tablet, and then a large screen. And while we use the screen resolutions to help us figure out which is which, we also have to recognize that your phone probably has higher resolution than your computer. I mean, unless you're running a really high-end gaming PC, your computer screen is 1920 by 1080. And your phone is very much higher resolution than that. So we have to find a way to figure out how to tell the browser in the head section, and particularly in the CSS, hey, I'm on a mobile device. Hey, I'm on a tablet. Hey, I'm showing portrait or landscape size. And how big am I? And I need to learn that in my CSS so that I can turn around and reformat my page based on that. And that's going to go back to using some of those CSS rules again. Now, if I take a look at an example page here that implements media queries and responsive design nicely, I see I've got a page that when I stretch it out to my full 1920 by 1080, it's just a feed of BMX videos. Not overly exciting. The interesting part comes when I start to squish it. And at first, it's just like our page. It's flexible in its layout. It's just scaling things. But once I get small enough, and it keeps scaling the videos down and down and down, and once I get small enough, it's going to pop. And that pop is what we call responsive design. It switched from being a grid of videos to the point where the videos and the titles became so small they're not useful. And so it changed the layout. And that is a responsive design as opposed to a flexible. That ability to switch. So how do they do that? Well, part of the way we do that is by using a thing we call media queries. And media queries are a CSS function that let us detect what specific media we're running on and to change certain CSS elements based on that. Quite often when we write our media queries, we write them in a separate CSS file, and we will detect, mostly based on screen size, how big or how wide the screen is. The CSS that we do inside that media queries will be a clone of the regular style.css that we're using with the appropriate changes for things we want to overwrite. So you don't have to copy everything. You only copy the things you're overwriting. Let's see if I can put together a really simple way to describe it. I have a CodePen here, and the CodePen has nothing more than a box. It's just a single box. There's nothing amazing about it. And the CSS for this box just sets its background color and its height and its width. Then we override those things using the media query that we set up. The media query in CSS just involves adding the @media function. Inside the parameters for that, we tell it at what point do you change. If the max width is 1,000 pixels or more, the background color is this color, the blue. If the max width is under 500 pixels, it changes color. And in CodePen, we can change this by dragging the sidebar. Let's take a look. As we drag it smaller, it changes to the yellow. It's triggering this second media query, and it's only overwriting the thing that we want to change. If we look back at this design, we're going to have a media query that when we get a screen size below a certain number, we're going to change the number of videos from row-oriented in our flexbox to column-oriented in our flexbox. And we're going to scale them to fit. So instead of giving them a specific scale or a percentage, like these are probably 33%, we would change it to 100% and orient them column-wise. So we're just changing a couple styles when we hit a certain dimension. Again, we can look back at our CodePen example and stretch it out wide, and we can see it switches colors again. So it's got a default color, and when we stretch wide, we've got a different color that triggers, and when we stretch narrow, we get a third color. Now, those are the tools for implementing. The specifics behind designing for it really mean that if you want something truly responsive, you design for the hardest thing first. And the hardest thing is almost always your mobile phone. And the mobile phone, not because of the smallest resolution, but because it's got the smallest physical screen, meaning dealing with fonts is a bit of a challenge, and dealing with how do I click on things. I mean, on your phone, there's no such thing as a hover. You can't get your finger to hit exactly the right spot and not be actually touching the screen. So you have to design your design without any sort of hover interactions and to fit on a mobile phone screen. The other thing is when we look at these @media queries, there are other constraints or conditions we can plug into them. We can plug into them whether we're landscape or portrait mode. On our phones, if we're landscape mode, we're wide. If we're portrait, we're tall. So that might affect our design. When the phones report a size, they also don't report their true size. They report a smaller subset. And there's a chart that we'll look to find out what phone reports what when. Those devices report two different numbers. They report a scale factor and a size, a width by height. The reason they do that scale factor is because we don't want fonts to be so small we can't read them. And if we use just the native screen resolution on our phones, you'll find very quickly that the size of the font is itsy bitsy tiny micro, and no amount of glasses are enough for you to be able to read them. So what the phones report is a scale multiplier. So an iPhone might report a very different size. Now, I'm going to take this CodePen demo and I'm going to pull it up in the inspector. I'll try. And then we can look at that. And in the inspector, we have a way of seeing all of those media queries. That's what this button in the top corner does. When we click on that button, we go back to our web browser, what we'll see is the way that the browser thinks this will look on a specific device. Now, the default is this responsive device, and it tells you the resolution it thinks, and it tells you whether it's scaled it or not. And the throttling part here is all about how quick would this download over certain kinds of network conditions. No throttling, you're on a wired network. Mid-tier mobile means you're on a wireless network of some kind, which is your Wi-Fi to your computer, right? Or you're on a reasonably good mobile phone connection. Low-tier mobile, well, you can figure that out. And they also have a bunch of presets here. So, for instance, if I look at the iPhone 12 Pro, you notice the iPhone 12 Pro reports 390 by 844. And anyone who's got an iPhone 12 will tell you that the screen is a whole lot more resolution than 390 by 844. But the screen also has a 3 times multiplier. In other words, the screen resolution is triple that. The reason it reports it as a 3 times scaling plus a 390 by 844 screen is so that we can use one of those elements, the 390 by 844, for font sizing, and we can use the 3 times that for anything else. Now, you can also flip this around. This little button here will flip it into portrait, to landscape mode, and back again. And we can interact with the sign. You'll also notice here I have a little dot. That dot represents my finger. One of the other constraints we have to design for when we're dealing with responsive sites is the fact that your mouse is highly accurate at pointing and picking things, and your meat sticks, your fingers, are not. Typically, a finger we kind of refer to as about 50 pixels square, which is a fairly large blob on the screen if you're trying to tap on something, click on something, or select something. And this goes into how big do I make my buttons? Right? Never make a button that's not at least 50 pixels tall. Typically, we want them a little bit bigger than that so they're relatively easy to find and tap with our finger. So how do we get to making all of our sites nice and responsive? Well, the first thing we got to do is get kind of a guide for what are the different scales and resolutions that we would use. And here we can start to look at what kind of size layouts do we want. And the Adobe XD site has this kind of idea here. We typically, when we're thinking responsive sites, we'll come up with 3 or 4 different pop points or change points, from mobile to tablet to laptop to large screen. Large screens these days, this guy on the end, I would consider anything bigger than 1920 by 1080, which is full high definition. Anything bigger than that, your 4K display, your Retina display, your widescreen curved monitor, your big gaming monitor, your elaborate displays are typically those large displays. And your laptop display typically these days is that full high definition display, or if you're on a Mac, it's going to be a Retina display or a 4K laptop. When we get down to the tablet, we're going to get into the 1920 by 1080 or maybe a little bit smaller. And then the phones, they're the weird ones. They're the ones that have that multiplication factor in them. So what we really need when we're going to do our scaling is we're going to need to find some sort of chart for responsive design. And we can find these online. Let's see if we find the defaults, kind of. There we go. So here's another one. This is just diving through websites here. But this is the information we're looking for. So desktop from 1024 by 768 through 1920 by 1080. That's probably our laptop size these days. Mobile displays pretty close. Tablets somewhere in between. I would say tablets up to probably 1920 as well. I might collapse down to 3 different sizes. We'll go back to the beginning when we started figuring out what our website needed to do. I had you sit down on a piece of paper and draw it out. When you draw it out and you want it to be responsive, you start by drawing it out for the smallest device. That's the hardest one to do. It's easier to scale things up than it is to squish things down. It's easier to add menus and sidebars and stretch content out than it is to try and figure out what do you do when you lose that sidebar? What do you do when that menu doesn't fit and your content at the same time? So once we kind of pick the sizes we want, and we do our paper layout for the smallest size, we then need to do the paper layout for the medium size and the large size, and if we're doing an extra large size. One of those will be the default. And all of the others will use this @media with a size scale to change the way it works. And then I would suggest that we put these together in a separate CSS file. So we're going to take a look at putting that together. Let's see where I'm going to grab that from. My little demo thing here. And there we go. So let's take a look at our particular page here. I have a flexible layout done with a flexbox. I'm going to add media queries to it to try and make it responsive. I'm going to, I guess, leave that menu in but scale it when I get to a smaller size. And then I'm going to change my layout to not wrap things and center them like this, but actually to left align them when I start to wrap them. So in order to do that, I need to put some stuff into my Visual Studio Code. And the things I'm going to put in there, really, I'm not going to do a lot of crazy stuff. I'm going to use an @media function to figure out how I'm going to decide which way to go. Now, one of the other things we're going to have to deal with here is there's a bunch of different conditions we can use with these media queries, they call them. And those media queries, typically you can either go up in size, in other words, we have a default size, and when it's below this, do something. If it's below that, do something. If it's below that, do something. Or we can go up in size. In other words, if it's bigger than something, you just have to get them in the right kind of order. I'm going to do this in a separate file. So I'm going to start by creating a new style sheet. Now remember, we're going to put our media queries in here, and we're only going to override the things we want to change at each resolution. Okay. And I'm going to pick 3 levels that I'm going to work at. So I'm going to create that new file. And just like all our other files, I'm going to go here and grab my name and put it in the top. And then I'm going to use these media queries to figure out exactly what steps we're going to use. So at media is where we start. Now you can see the auto-completion trying to guess here for me. We can work with the screen or with the printer. That's entirely up to us. Typically we're working just with the screen. And I can set multiple conditions. In this case, I want a screen with a pixel ratio. That's that multiplication ratio. So and no, you won't remember these things. I don't remember these things either. You use the CSS guide or the auto completion here to help you. And the other one I want is a certain screen resolution. I'm just going to pick that. Now in here, what we're going to do is just override our existing styles for screens up to 700 pixels, where their minimum width is 700 pixels. And I'm going to replicate this and step up the pixel count here. Except this time, I'm going to go to, say, 1300. That gives me the 1280 resolution. And I might go a step higher, right? Or I might go a step lower. Now, we saw in the inspector 380 by something. I'm going to just pick like 320. I'm going to make another one of these. And do it down at 320. I'm going to take... Pardon me?
Did you share the link of the live?
Delete off the line?
No, the link of the live here.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
First, thank you.
There we go. My apologies.
Thank you.
I'll throw the extra comments in here. write this the right way. So the way these work is when your screen size is really small, okay, then it takes all your CSS in, your base, your colors, your styles, and then the media one rolls in last and says, hey, up to 320 pixels, it's just whatever you designed in your media CSS, in your main CSS. But if there's anything you need to override between 320 pixels wide and 700 pixels wide, you put it here. And if there's anything that you need to override between 700 and 1300, you put it here. And everything over 1300, you can put in here. And you can step these as many steps as you want. And there's some pretty standard resolutions for screen resolutions. Like I said, 1920 by 1080 is kind of full high definition, normal, typical computer screen. There was a period where most laptops were 1366 by 768. A lot of the times, modern laptops will be the 1440 by 900 resolution. 4K, or not 4K, but the first kind of retina display, and they call them retina displays because the pixels are so close together that the human eye can't see the difference between them. So a retina display doesn't imply a specific resolution. It's a resolution over the dimensions of the screen. So an iPhone's retina display is going to be much lower resolution than a MacBook Pro's retina display. But that typically kind of starts at the 2560 by 1440 range. That's kind of the place where the pixels are so small it's really hard to see the difference between them. There's a couple intermediate sizes. There's a couple older sizes at 1280 by 720 and 1200, 1280 by 800. Those are kind of weird sizes for older laptops as they go. And then mobile devices also have a weird and wild range, which is why I'm just picking round numbers here. You know, if I design everything for the iPhone, then it's going to look like crap on every Android device. And if I design everything for every Android device, well, I'll have a million media queries because no Android device seems to be able to be the same as any other Android device in terms of size or scale. So we're going to pick some nice ones in the middle. Now let's see if we can make something simple and straightforward so that we can see it happen. In my menu here, I'm going to change the font. I want to make the font smaller in the really small sizes. And I'm going to change the background color just so I can see something's working. So the styles I'm doing that in my styles here, go find my menu. In my menu, I've got a font size. So this guy, I'm going to change. So I'm going to copy it. I'm going to put it in here. And at the small size, I'm going to make fonts big. No, I'm not going to do that. Let's go. Well, let's make them really stupid large so that we see the difference. And I'm not going to put anything in that last one, which means I'm not going to override what it already is, which is 24. So it'll look a little weird. I'm going to change the color as well, just so I can see what's going on. So inside here, where do I set the color for that menu? Well, I use this background color highlight. So I'm just going to change in the dot menu class. And I'm going to change this to red just so I can see it. And I'll make this one blue. Cyan. Just so I can see what's going on. So with those loaded, I'm going to get them loaded in the head section. They're going to override a couple things. Let's bring our page back in and see what happens. Reload it now. It might be much. Not making any difference. But let's run the inspector here. And it's not loading my style. It'll tell you on the side here. Let's get rid of that too. There we go. Got a min width there. And let's reload it. Just want to see that it's loading that media. Font size 24. We'll just try and make it. And it goes down to 400. So let's just change our values there. Just to get some ranges we can see. Not picking them up. Why is it not picking them up? I have made a mistake somewhere. Attach this. Get things to do what we want them to do. Not picking up my styles. Well, I've got to fix that bug. Let me sort that out. Let's take a short break while I figure out what mistake I made. That means it's not finding my stuff. All right. And we'll come back at 10:45 and finish up looking at some of this media query stuff. Right. Right. I figured out my mistake. It was one of those things that I got a little too crazy with. The mistake I had is adding this clause in to my media queries. That clause was looking for something that had a 2-to-1 pixel ratio. Those multiples of those pixel ratios only happen on phones. This isn't a phone, this is a browser, and therefore this particular media query was never getting triggered. So when I take that clause out, so I'm just looking for the screen and a width of at least 320 pixels, and I go back to my site and I shrink it down to over 320 but less than 700 pixels, I can see that it turns red with yellow text. As I make the window bigger, up to 700 pixels, it'll be this particular red and yellow combo. Over 700 pixels, it'll be blue and antique white until it gets to 1,000 pixels wide. And at 700, it immediately pops. And then when we get to 1,000 pixels, it'll pop again. So that's a responsive reaction to us scaling the browser. Now, I'm just playing with the menus and the menu colors so you can see them happen. The most common thing that we do with media queries in reality is we change a container size. So if we looked at, in particular, in our layout here, I have this container. This container has a certain size to it. It fits in the middle of the screen, and I've got a bunch of samples in this media area. And what I would look through is look through my container sizes and my area sizes, and inside the media queries I would change the size of them so that they could have either a bigger item or more items across widthwise. Let's put 2 more items in here and see what they do. Now I'm going to add another style there so they look a little bit different. What do I have that I can reuse here? So area, container, we don't have a width on those things. Content rows. We'll just look for container, content, rows. Just going to stretch them out. We'll have to add something to do a slightly different color. So with the sample, let's do dot sample light. We'll just override the color, background color. Oh, I don't want the whole thing. Yeah, sure. Now let's look at our page. Okay, and we'll use the sample light here. There we go. Check it out. We got lots of things, and they're kind of overflowing. And the sizes of them are dictated by the sample size, so we're going to override the width with our media queries. So we're going to take samples width. And we're just going to change the width, nothing else. For the little ones, for the smaller sizes, we're going to make them 100 pixels wide. because the default is 150 pixels wide. For this size, we're going to make them 125 pixels wide. Just to start with, draw a line in the sand, see what it looks like. And for the large ones, we're going to leave them alone. Let them go to full size. In fact, I might even make this more dramatic. Make them 75 pixels wide. Make these 125. I might change the height as well. Instead of 150, I might change the height to be 75 as well. There we go. And now we can go check that out. You can see at this size, all our little image boxes change size as we grow. Pop once, pop twice. That's how we set up and use media queries. From a design side, you may want to look at some examples. And again, I'm just bringing up the sites that I'll link to you in Moodle. If we look at some of these samples, you'll see that even Mozilla's page has a very responsive look. And it's kind of expected these days. If you're building a commercial site, it's going to be responsive by default. People are going to view your site on a mobile device sooner or later. In this case, they've done 4 steps. So Mozilla has the mobile with the long scroll, it has a tablet size, it has a laptop size, and it has a desktop size. And each one of them alter the layout a little bit. If you look, this kind of shield icon image at the top is very much missing on the lower scales. Codacy, which is a coding site for how to build certain things for the web, has the same idea going on. They've restructured their whole header and footer depending on which media you're viewing it on. Code Climate, same idea here, changing the way the site looks depending on the size or the width of the browser. Pull request, Yale University, Cornell University. You can see the various different layouts that the designers have chosen and then implemented using media queries. So it's one of the more useful things to get to know how to play with. Now the last bit of that whole responsive thing is described really well, and I'll put the link to this site. But the last part of that puzzle is to make sure your images are responsive as well. And there's a very good illustration of it in this site, so I'll just link the site to it for you to look at later. The gist of it is not all images need to be the same size, and specifically, the bigger the image is, the longer it takes to download to your browser. Long download equals slow. So if your website has 400 images in it, if you can make those images smaller, they're going to load faster. And that's going to be better for your end user. The other thing to recognize, as you see in the image behind me, small image versus large image, if you cut the dimension in 2, in other words, if you go from 1,000 pixels wide to 500 pixels wide, you're actually cutting the size of the image in 4. If you look at that small image, it's roughly 1/4 of the size of the large image if you overlap the two, because you're cutting the dimension in half in both directions. So we're shrinking it. 1/4 the size is significant enough that it's 1/4 the amount of time to load. So when we're doing responsive designs, we want to follow that up by making any images we use in multiple sizes, using the media queries to choose which image to download. And this is where you'll find images that are named, and then we'll have an underscore and a SM for small or underscore LG for large in them. And what we'll do is we'll override the CSS that loads the background image. That one line says background image, URL, whatever. We will overload that in the media query to load the correct size image for that media query. In my small size here, I would overload any of the CSS that loads images to load a smaller sized image. Now, if you don't do this, your website's still going to work. What you're going to do, though, is you're going to hand control to some programmer to scale your image down. And when they scale your image down, I can tell you how they're going to do it. They're going to do it brute force. And what I mean by brute force is they're going to take every group of 4 pixels and they're going to find the color that averages those 4, and they're going to replace those 4 pixels with one of the new color. It means your image is going to get blurry, and it's going to lose quality, and it's going to shrink. And that'll happen regardless. You can't control that unless you provide an image of the right size. So the particular article here goes through the details behind how exactly can you create images that your media queries work. And there's a couple different ways to do it, and this article goes into them. In fact, this whole series is actually a really good series of web pages for you to bookmark to set up how you're going to build web pages. It covers a number of topics. In this particular case, it's talking about responsive image sizes, how to make sure that your images are the right size for your display. It talks about standard resolution and retina resolution here. The principle is the same regardless of the numbers. If you need to shrink something down, you'll take those 4 pixels and you will average their color and drop it into a new pixel, and now you're 1/4 the size. So what we really want to do is figure out design-wise how many different steps or gradients we're going to do. We want to design for the lowest resolution, the phone first, make it look good there. And we're going to need to do multiple designs. And then we're going to set up some media queries on some major breakpoints between those different sizes and resolutions. Then we're going to itemize all the images that need to be scaled and have multiple copies of those images in our images folder, and have the media queries pick out the right images. And just to be clear, all of this is optional. You don't need to do any of it for the assignment you need to hand in for me. We're not going to look at any sort of responsive design things as a requirement at all. Now, the article goes into talking about different image formats. There is a scalable vector graphics format. If you're comfortable with things like Illustrator, you could make elaborate images in Illustrator, export them as scalable vector graphic images, and they will scale nicely without you having to do additional work. The web understands SVG, or scalable vector graphics images, and will auto-scale them nicely without you having to make multiple copies of them. So it goes into the same kind of ideas of having a small version, a tablet version, and a full-size version, and what are you going to do about each of those individual elements? How are you going to scale the images? How are you going to include them? They have some techniques in here for using image tags to do this. These are perfectly valid to follow. I prefer using background images because I can do some additional things with them. The last thing I'm going to get into with you, we're going to switch gears again, is we're going to go and take a look a little bit at transforms. And then I'm going to give you some time to throw me kind of your worst questions and things that are holding you up right now. One of the things that's kind of a challenge doing this stuff online is getting around to each one of you to be able to help where you get stuck instead of having to, or having a TA you can contact, or having some problems you can reach out and get solved right away. So we'll try and look at some of those today. All right, the last piece I'm going to look at here, we're going to look at not the animation part, although I can show you that again. We're going to take a look at transforms. And this is going to involve some math. So hold on. I'm going to try not to make it too crazy. Okay. Everything we do graphically, whether you believe you're in the midst of doing it mathematically or not, involves some math in the background. The downside is you kind of, in any creative discipline these days that involves technology, you need to understand the math that's going on to be really, really, really successful with it. The upside is you don't have to be able to do the math. And I want to make that distinction absolutely clear. Okay? You need to know what scaling something is. You don't need to know how to mathematically do the scaling. We have tools that will do the math for you. So don't be afraid of the math. I just want you to understand what scale means as opposed to translate or rotate. Okay? Now, a couple pieces of terminology that you're unfortunately going to run into. Again, you don't need to be able to do this. You just need to understand what they are. A vector, when people talk about a vector, is a line. A line typically from the origin to some point in the world. Okay, that's all it is. Don't worry about how it's represented mathematically. Don't worry about how we can manipulate it. In addition to that, we can create a collection of these things, and we call those a matrix of vectors. So a matrix is a way to manipulate a vector, and again, you don't need to know how the math works. You just need to know that you can create together a mathematical grid of numbers that can manipulate any vector. Okay, why is that important? Well, because sooner or later, you're going to have something on the screen that you want to transform from where it is now to where it is in the future. You want to change the way it appears or looks. And there's these 5 basic operations that we can do. We do them in CSS because we have automatic functions that do all the heavy lifting, all the math for us. So again, I don't need to know how to do a translation between a vector and a matrix. What I do need to know is that translation moves something from one place to another, and that what I need to provide it is a vector or the new location it's going to be at. Rotations move things. They rotate them around a particular point or axis. Where it gets tricky is when we start thinking about how do we move things. So if I'm thinking about this div in the web and I want to translate it, what I'm talking about doing is taking its origin and moving it to another place. Translation is moving it to another place. Okay? Rotation is going to rotate it around that pivot point. And be clear, the pivot point in the web is the upper left corner. Meaning if you want something to rotate like this, you have to combine these two things. You have to take the pivot point that it's going to rotate around. You have to translate the object. Then you have to rotate it. And then you have to translate it back. And that's how you rotate something. To scale it, you're going to make it bigger or smaller. That's all it is. You're just changing the size of it. Now, when we talk about skewing things, we talk about twisting or rotating them. As much as our web browser is a 2D layer-based display. We can fake things that look sort of 3D by skewing them. You know, we can twist them in a way that gives the parallel lines a place where they're not parallel. This looks very much in perspective when you look at it. And that's a skew operation. And why would we do that? Well, how many times have you seen a site that's had a wonderful banner that looks really 3D and comes out towards you? It's a skewed banner. Well, how do we make that happen? We take our text, we put it in a div, and we tell the CSS to skew it one line. It does all the hard math for us. Okay? When we're playing around with these things, they're all done through CSS. Skip through this one. So we talked about doing our animation before by using keyframes. That changes things over time. Well, instead of changing around the background position, I might actually turn around and change a transform. And we can do this. That's not that. Let me go back to that slide. There we go. And we can do this by applying these transforms. It might make more sense if I can actually make something happen and work that way. Let's take a look at our media query in CodePen again. When we change color, it's changing color based on the size. So that's using the media query to trigger it. Well, let's use that to trigger a transform. Right here, we've got this. When it goes under 500 pixels, change it to this color. Well, let's replace that. Let's take our box. We're going to change its color, but let's transform it. And the first transform I'm going to do is a translation. And for the translation, we just tell it how far to move it in X and how far to move it in Y. Oops. Look at that. Right. Now when we change, see it translates, it moves. So we change our media query. Okay, let's do something else with it. Instead of translation, let's go ahead and rotate it. I think I remembered that, right? So now I'm going to rotate it 45 degrees. Let's try that skew. Now, let me go check out the parameters here. Sure, degrees. There we go. And then we'll trigger it. There's that skew operation. Now we can play around with some of these and we can add them together. Again, you don't need to know how to do the math. You just need to know what a rotation is versus a skew versus a transform or translation. Let's rotate. Trying to think which is up. Rotate Y. Is that what it is? Yes. I'm just using the command completion in the live share to look up how to do the rotation. Let's go 25 degrees. Any guesses? Okay, let's try. Now, let's do some funky stuff so we can see where the center is. And let's try this. Put another div around this guy. I think I got them in the wrong order. But let's try it out anyways. Let's see. Not showing up. There we go. There we go. So all I did in here is I created a div inside my box that was the same height but half the width. And I put a border around it so I could see where it was. And now I get this red line down the middle. So when I rotate something, I can see the rotation happen a little bit more easily. Now let's try and rotate it in a different axis. And if I take the skew out, just do the rotation. So I'm rotating in Z this way. You notice in X you don't see it. Now, in Y, why does it look like it doesn't change? Well, Y is up. So when I rotate in Y, okay, take a plane and I rotate it in Y, it just looks a little narrower. You know, it just looks a little narrower. Now, if you're playing with this stuff, and you can in these CodePen demos, you could also play around with, so how do I make something spin? Okay. Well, we could use that animate element again. If I go back to the keyframe animation, a little hello. What if I change the animation? And then I start to rotate it. Transform, rotate Y. Let's do 45 degrees. And then we'll do a couple other steps here. And you see it start to twist and rotate as we go. And now you can start to see it twist and rotate around a little bit. So use these code pens to play around and try different kinds of elements to play with and to make them look really cool, do some fancy effects. You get it working in the code pen, you know which things to drag or copy and paste into your CSS, and you can play with how they look together and how they play and work together. That's enough fancy stuff. I'm sure that this stuff is going to take a while to sink into your brain. The trick with looking and learning how these work is also looking them up in the manual. If you look at the W3 schools, transforms, not only do they give you examples that you can try yourself and show you how they work, but they also give you diagrams on how you should think of them and all the different details behind how they rotate around. And you can look at the transforms here, all done with CSS. Translate, rotate, scale, and you can scale and rotate and translate all at the same time. Don't worry about the matrix method. That's about combining them all at the same time. That's like putting them all together. So there's an excellent review here when you want to look at it. You can do 3D transforms as well. So you can figure out how to make things flip and turn and look in 2 and 3 dimensions. So this is all kind of the fun stuff. There's a few more links I've got in Moodle as well. The CSS Zen Garden and CSS Tricks are wonderful resources for this kind of stuff. Don't reinvent it yourself. Just reuse what other people have done and give them credit. Put a comment on where you got it from, the link to where you got it. We do this all the time. We can go to CSS Tricks and say, hey, where's a cool way to do something? And we can just search for animation. And we get a ton of hits on different kind of cool animating things that people have done and shared. So feel free to experiment with that stuff. The final part I'll give you, and then we'll open it up for anybody that needs any additional kind of help or has specific problems. But do not get frustrated with the fact that this doesn't sink in right away. This is a different way of thinking when you start translating HTML and CSS code into something the browser draws on the screen. It takes practice. You need to do it a lot to get good at it. And when we start thinking about how exactly are we going to get good at all of these things? You just have to build more and more sites. Push this back to the beginning. All of the fancy things that we do are all things to attract people to go look at our sites. And they don't just come overnight, and they don't just come first time we write it and it just works. And more, and the deeper you get into it, the more it's a experimental exploration of how do I creatively get this stuff to do that thing, which is going to be no different than any other design class you have. How do I get this stuff to do that thing that I need? So stick with it. You find the dividends will pay off at the end of the road when you look at the 30 or 40 different design companies in Vancouver, and predominantly what they're looking for is multidisciplinary people who can do multiple things at once. They're far more employable. And this is one of the ways to get yourself in the door. Right? That's it for me. We are